The crystal stemware caught the amber light of the private dining room like captured fire, each piece positioned with military precision on the black marble table. Jin-Woo Park sat with the controlled stillness of a predator at rest, his charcoal suit immaculate despite the tension crackling through the air like electricity before a storm. Across from him, three men in expensive Italian leather shoes shifted with the barely contained energy of sharks circling wounded prey. Whether you're watching this from the bustling streets of New York or the quiet suburbs of Ohio, you know that feeling when you walk into a room and immediately sense danger lurking beneath polite conversation. Tonight, that danger wore $1,000 suits and spoke in carefully measured tones. The Lotus Garden was the kind of establishment where conversations could reshape empires or end lives, where the 24-karat gold fixtures reflected secrets worth killing for. Zara Williams moved through this world of whispered threats and calculated smiles like a ghost in black and white, her server's uniform a camouflage that rendered her invisible to men who measured worth in bullets and bank accounts. But invisibility was her superpower in a place where being seen too clearly could prove fatal. She had learned to read the language of power during her 3 years serving the city's most dangerous elite. The way fingertips drummed against crystal meant impatience. The slight tightening around eyes signaled a lie being told. The careful placement of hands near lapels indicated concealed weapons. Tonight, every signal screamed that someone was about to die. Jin-Woo's reputation preceded him into every room like a cold wind. The Beach Syndicate answered to him with the unwavering loyalty reserved for legends, and legends in his world were written in blood. At 32, he commanded an empire built on precision, honor, and the absolute certainty that crossing him meant vanishing without a trace. Yet as Zara approached with the evening's wine selection, she noticed something that made her steps falter almost imperceptibly. His hands trembled, just barely, like autumn leaves in a breeze so subtle it might have been imagined. But Zara Williams had built her life on noticing what others missed, and Jin-Woo Park's hands never trembled. The older man across from him, silver-haired and smiling with the warmth of a winter morning, lifted his glass in what appeared to be a toast. His name was Chun Liu, and his presence at this table meant tonight's business involved the kind of territorial negotiations that left widows and orphans in their wake. Chen's companions flanked him like bookends of barely controlled violence. The younger one had the dead eyes of a killer, while the one nearest the window kept glancing at his watch with the nervous energy of someone following a precise timeline. Zara's instincts, honed by years of navigating dangerous waters, began screaming warnings. The wine service should have been routine. Pour, retraite, roman invisible. But as she approached Jin-Woo's glass, she caught the faint bitter almond scent that had nothing to do with the vintage being served. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory, warning about the smell that meant death was stirring itself into seemingly innocent refreshments. Jin-Woo's dark eyes met hers for the briefest instant, and she saw something that chilled her more than his reputation ever could. Fear, not the healthy caution of a careful businessman, but the desperate panic of a man who had just realized he was trapped in a cage of his own making. The room held its breath as Chun raised his glass higher, his smile widening with predatory satisfaction. The timeline was precise, choreographed like a deadly ballet. Jin-Woo would drink. The poison would work quickly and quietly. By morning, the beach territory would be carved up like a feast among the victors. But Zara Williams had not survived 3 years in this shark tank by following scripts written by other people. Her elbow caught the edge of Chen's wine glass as she reached across to adjust the centerpiece, sending the crimson liquid splashing across his pristine shirt front. The movement was so natural, so perfectly clumsy, that even she almost believed it was an accident. Chaos erupted in controlled explosions of outrage and demand for napkins. Chen's men half rose from their chairs, hands moving instinctively toward concealed weapons before catching themselves. In the confusion, Zara quickly switched Jin-Woo's wine glass with her own, the one she had filled from a different bottle entirely. Apologies flowed from her lips like honey as she dabbed at Chen's ruined shirt, her movements providing cover as Jinwoo processed what had just happened. His eyes locked onto hers again, and this time she saw a recognition flash across his features like lightning illuminating a storm-dark sky. The older man's face had shifted from predatory satisfaction to barely controlled fury. His timeline was broken, his careful choreography reduced to farce by a clumsy waitress who was proving to be anything but clumsy. As the immediate chaos subsided, In-shun accepted a replacement shirt from the restaurant's emergency wardrobe. Jinwoo raised his switched glass in a mirror of the earlier toast. His voice, when it came, carried the weight of absolute authority despite the knowledge of how close he had come to his final breath. "Thank you for the wine recommendation," he said, his words directed at Shun, but his gaze finding Zara's face. "I find I have developed quite particular tastes recently." The subtext hung in the air between them like smoke. Chen's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as he realized his moment had passed. His perfect plan unraveled by an observant woman in a server's uniform who had dared to interfere with the deadly game of kings. But as the evening progressed, and the business meeting concluded with handshakes that promised future conflicts rather than resolve tensions, Zara understood that saving Jinwoo Park's life had fundamentally altered the trajectory of her own. In the world of the Beach Syndicate, debts were always repaid, and the most dangerous man in the city now owed her everything. The room fell silent as Chun and his men departed, their footsteps echoing like gunshots in the marble hallway. Jinwoo remained seated, studying the wine glass that should have been his tomb, while Zora gathered the remnants of the dinner service with hands that betrayed none of the adrenaline coursing through her system. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the quiet intensity of a man who had just looked death in the face and found salvation wearing a waitress uniform. "Please," he said, the single word containing multitudes of desperation and gratitude. The black sedan glided through the city's arterial streets like a shadow given form, its tinted windows reflecting the neon signs that painted the night in electric blues and reds. Zara sat in the back seat between two men who radiated the kind of stillness that came from absolute confidence in their capacity for violence, while Jinwoo occupied the space across from her with the controlled presence of a storm temporarily contained. The restaurant felt like a different lifetime already, though barely an hour had passed since she had thrown herself between a crime boss and his assassins. The adrenaline was fading now, replaced by the cold clarity that came with understanding exactly how irrevocably her world had shifted. In the space of a heartbeat, she had transformed from invisible server to key player in a game where the stakes were measured in heartbeats and shallow graves. Jinwoo studied her with the intensity of a man solving a complex equation, his dark eyes cataloging every detail of her composure. She refused to fidget under his scrutiny, instead meeting his gaze with the steady calm that had carried her through 3 years of serving men who viewed other human beings as disposable resources. If he expected her to crumble under the weight of what she had done, he would discover that Zara Williams had been forged in fires far hotter than his intimidation. The vehicle turned into a private underground garage beneath a glass tower that pierced the sky like a steel needle, its upper floors disappearing in low-hanging clouds. The beach building stood as a monument to legitimate business built on decidedly illegitimate foundations, where pharmaceutical patents and construction contracts masked the true source of Jinwoo's empire. As they descended into the depths of the structure, Zara realized she was entering a world that existed parallel to the one where normal people worried about rent payments and grocery bills. The elevator rose in silence, broken only by the subtle whisper of expensive machinery, each floor representing another layer of Jinwoo's domain. When the doors finally opened onto the penthouse level, Zara stepped into a space that redefined her understanding of luxury. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of the city sprawling below like a circuit board of lights, while minimalist furniture in blacks and whites created clean lines that emphasized the room's vast proportions. This was a fortress disguised as an office, a place where empires were managed and enemies eliminated with equal efficiency. The scent of sandalwood and leather permeated the air, creating an atmosphere of masculine control that made Zara acutely aware of how far she had traveled from the familiar chaos of her two-bedroom apartment. Jin-woo moved to the bar cart positioned near the windows, his movements carrying the fluid grace of a man comfortable with command. When he poured 2 glasses of whiskey that probably cost more than her monthly salary, Zara noted that his hands no longer trembled. Here, in his domain, he had reclaimed the absolute authority that had made him a legend among dangerous men. "You saved my life tonight," he said, offering her one of the glasses. His voice carried the weight of a man unaccustomed to owing debts, especially to women whose existence he should never have noticed. "In my world, debts of that magnitude create complications." Zara accepted the whiskey but did not drink, her mind racing through the implications of his words. Complications in Jin-woo Park's world typically resolve themselves through violence or disappearance, neither of which appeared on her list of acceptable career moves. She had acted on instinct, driven by an inexplicable compulsion to prevent a murder she could have simply witnessed in silence. "The Chun family will not forget what happened tonight," he continued, settling into the leather chair across from her with the controlled grace of a predator temporarily at rest. "They will interpret your intervention as a declaration of war on their interests. In their calculation, you have become a weapon pointed at their organization." The weight of his words settled over her like a heavy blanket, suffocating in its implications. She had saved one man's life and inadvertently signed her own death warrant in the process. The bitter irony was not lost on her that doing the right thing had placed her squarely in the crosshairs of killers who viewed conscience as a character flaw to be permanently corrected. "So what are my options?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear beginning to coil in her stomach like a living thing. "Walk away and hope they forget, or disappear into witness protection for the rest of my life?" Jin-woo's smile held no warmth, only the acknowledgement of a complex problem requiring an elegant solution. Neither option would guarantee your survival. The Chun organization has resources that extend into witness protection programs, and forgetting is not among their organizational strengths. However, I can offer you a third alternative. He leaned forward slightly, his presence filling the space between them with magnetic intensity. "Work for me. Become my cultural liaison and personal assistant. Your insights tonight demonstrated an understanding of behavioral patterns that could prove invaluable in my business dealings. In return, you would have the protection of the Beach Syndicate and compensation that reflects the value of your services." The offer hung in the air between them like a bridge spanning a chasm, beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. Zara understood that she was being presented with a choice between different types of cages, each offering its own combination of safety and imprisonment. Working for Jin-woo meant entering a world where violence was currency and loyalty was purchased with blood, but refusing meant facing the Chun family's vengeance with nothing but her own resourcefulness as protection. "I have a family," she said finally, "a younger brother in college, parents who depend on my income. Whatever arrangement we make needs to account for their safety." Jin-woo nodded with the satisfaction of a man who had correctly calculated her primary vulnerabilities. "Your family will receive the same protection extended to all valuable beach assets. Your brother's tuition will be handled through our educational foundation, and your parents will find their mortgage mysteriously resolved through anonymous benefactors." The golden cage was taking shape around her with every word, beautiful in its luxury, but absolute in its control. Zara recognized that she was negotiating the terms of her own captivity with a man who had elevated manipulation to an art form. Yet beneath his calculated offer, she sensed something else, a thread of genuine respect for the courage she had displayed in saving his life. "And if I want to leave?" she asked. "If this arrangement becomes unbearable." His pause stretched long enough for her to hear the city humming 40 floors below them, a reminder of the ordinary world that seemed increasingly distant with every passing moment. Leaving would be complicated, he admitted. Knowledge of beach operations carries certain responsibilities, but I'm not in the business of keeping unwilling employees. The subtext was clear enough. She could leave when she was dead or when he decided she was no longer useful, whichever came first. But something in his tone suggested that he understood the value of willing cooperation over forced compliance, that her usefulness lay precisely in her independence of spirit. What would my actual responsibilities involve? She pressed, determined to understand the full scope of the trap before stepping into it willingly. Reading people, identifying threats and opportunities in social situations. Accompanying me to meetings where your presence might provide insights unavailable to my usual associates. Acting as a buffer between my organization and the legitimate business world where your background would prove invaluable. Translation, she thought grimly. Professional human shield with cultural interpretation duties. But as Golden Cages went, it offered more freedom than outright captivity and infinitely better odds of survival than facing the Chin family alone. The choice between certain death and possible survival was not really a choice at all. I accept your offer, she said, lifting the whiskey glass in a mock toast to her own surrender. But I want it understood that I work with you, not for you. Respect goes both directions, regardless of who signs the paychecks. Jean Wu's smile this time carried genuine warmth, the first crack in his armor of controlled authority. He lifted his own glass to meet hers, the crystal singing softly as they touched. Welcome to the Beach family, Zara Williams. I have a feeling this arrangement will prove mutually beneficial. As she sipped the whiskey and felt its warmth burn away the last vestiges of her old life, Zara realized she had just negotiated her way into the most dangerous job interview of her life. But for the first time since she had smelled bitter almonds and expensive wine, she felt something approaching hope. If she was going to be trapped in a cage of gold and violence, at least she would be trapped with a man intelligent enough to recognize her worth. The city glittered below them like scattered diamonds on black velvet, beautiful and merciless in the darkness. Tomorrow, she would begin learning the rules of a world where survival depended on reading the spaces between words and the shadows behind smiles. Tonight, she was simply a waitress who had saved a crime boss and discovered that some debts could only be repaid with a lifetime of service. 3 weeks into her new existence as Jean Wu Park's cultural liaison, Zara had learned to navigate the treacherous waters of legitimate business meetings that served as elaborate theater for criminal enterprises. The conference room on the 38th floor of the Beach building had become her stage, where she performed the delicate dance of reading micro-expressions and translating the unspoken languages of power that flowed beneath polite corporate conversation. The morning sun streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows as she observed Jean Wu conduct a negotiation with a pharmaceutical company seeking distribution rights for their new pain medication. To the 3 executives in expensive suits, this appeared to be a standard business meeting discussing market penetration and profit margins. But Zara recognized the subtle tells that revealed the true nature of the conversation. The way fingers drummed against leather portfolios when discussing territories, the careful euphemisms that transformed street corners into distribution points. The lead negotiator, a silver-haired man named Dr. Richardson, leaned back in his chair with the confidence of someone accustomed to controlling conversations. His smile never wavered, but Zara noticed how his left eye twitched almost imperceptibly when Jean Wu mentioned certain neighborhoods. The tell was subtle enough that most people would miss it entirely, but 3 years of reading dangerous customers had taught her to catalog every nervous habit that might signal deception or threat. She caught Jean Wu's eye and touched her own left temple briefly, their prearranged signal for deception detected. His acknowledgement was almost invisible, just a slight adjustment in his posture that indicated the message had been received and processed. The negotiation continued without interruption, but she watched him subtly adjust his approach, probing the areas that had triggered Richardson's nervous response. By lunch, They had uncovered a competing distribution network that Richardson had been concealing, information that would have cost the Beach organization significant territory and revenue if it had remained hidden. As the pharmaceutical executives departed with handshakes and promises of future cooperation, Zara realized that her unconventional background had become an invaluable weapon in Jean Wu's arsenal of corporate warfare. "You read Richardson perfectly," Jean Wu observed as they stood alone in the conference room, the city sprawling below them like a conquered kingdom. "His left eye betrays him when he encounters information that threatens his position. I would have missed it entirely." The acknowledgement carried more weight than simple professional appreciation. In the 3 weeks since their arrangement began, he had never once diminished her contributions or treated her insights as lucky guesses. Instead, he had integrated her observations into his decision-making process with the pragmatic efficiency of a man who recognized valuable resources regardless of their unexpected packaging. Their working relationship had evolved into something approaching partnership, though the underlying power dynamic remained as clear as crystal. She provided intelligence, he provided protection, and together they navigated a world where the wrong interpretation could result in territorial wars or unexplained disappearances. But today felt different, charged with undercurrents that had nothing to do with business negotiations and everything to do with the way he had begun looking at her when he thought she wasn't watching. The air between them hummed with tension that had been building like atmospheric pressure before a storm, growing heavier with each passing day. "You must be exhausted," he said, his voice carrying an unexpected note of concern. "These meetings require a level of concentration that would drain most people. Let me have a driver take you home early today." The offer surprised her with its consideration. In her previous life, restaurant managers had viewed exhaustion as weakness and concern for employee welfare as an expensive luxury. But Jean Wu seemed genuinely attentive to her well-being, as if her comfort mattered beyond its impact on her professional performance. "I'm fine," she replied, though the truth was that maintaining hypervigilance for hours at a time left her mentally drained in ways that physical labor never had. The constant analysis of facial expressions, vocal intonations, and body language required a sustained focus that was both exhilarating and exhausting. But admitting weakness felt dangerous in a world where vulnerability could be weaponized by enemies or allies alike. Jean Wu moved closer, close enough that she could detect the subtle scent of sandalwood and leather that had become associated with safety in her mind. The association disturbed her more than she cared to admit. The way her body had begun relaxing in his presence despite every rational instinct screaming that the most dangerous predator was often the one who made you feel safest. "You don't have to prove your strength to me, Zara," he said quietly. "I've already seen what you're capable of." Acknowledging limits is not weakness, it's intelligence. The sound of her name spoken in his carefully controlled voice sent unexpected warmth spiraling through her chest. Over the past weeks, their conversations have been strictly professional, a careful dance around the attraction that neither acknowledged, but both felt crackling between them like electricity seeking ground. She studied his face, noting the way the afternoon light highlighted the sharp angles of his cheekbones and the subtle signs of exhaustion around his eyes. Leading a criminal empire apparently required the same grueling schedule as any other demanding profession, though the consequences of poor decision-making were measured in body counts rather than quarterly profits. "What about you?" she asked, surprising herself with the boldness of the question. "When do you get to acknowledge your own limits?" His laugh held no humor, only the bitter recognition of a man trapped by expectations that allowed no room for human frailty. "In my position, limits are luxuries that my enemies will exploit without hesitation. The moment I show weakness, everything I've built becomes vulnerable to those who would tear it down for sport." "But you showed weakness to me," she observed. "That night in the restaurant, you asked for my help. You trusted me with your vulnerability." The admission hung between them like a bridge spanning dangerous territory, an acknowledgement of the moment when their carefully maintained professional boundaries had first begun to blur. Jean Wu's expression shifted, revealing glimpses of the man behind the carefully constructed armor of authority. "You were different," he said simply. "In that moment, I recognized something in you that I had almost forgotten existed. Genuine care for another person's welfare, without calculation or agenda. It has been so long since I encountered that quality that I almost didn't recognize it." The weight of his words settled over her like a warm blanket, wrapping around the careful distance she had been maintaining between them. She understood that he was offering her something precious and dangerous, a glimpse behind the mask that he wore to survive in a world where emotional honesty could prove fatal. Their moment of connection was shattered by the sudden appearance of his security chief, a granite-faced man named Kim, whose expression suggested urgent developments that couldn't wait for polite interruption. The professional mask snapped back into place over Jean Wu's features with practiced efficiency, though something in his eyes continued to hold her gaze for a heartbeat longer than necessary. "Sir, we have a situation that requires immediate attention," Kim announced, his voice carrying the controlled tension of a man delivering bad news to someone capable of lethal responses to unwelcome information. Jean Wu's transformation from vulnerable man to dangerous predator was instantaneous and complete. "Speak," he commanded, his voice dropping to the low register that made grown men reconsider their life choices. "Chen's organization has been making inquiries about Miss Williams. They've been approaching her former colleagues at the restaurant, asking questions about her family, her routines, her relationships. The activity suggests they're building a comprehensive profile for future action." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees as Jean Wu processed this information. Zara felt ice forming in her veins as she realized that her worst fears about the consequences of saving his life were beginning to materialize. The Chen family had not forgotten her interference, and their patience with indirect approaches was apparently reaching its limits. "Double the security detail on her family," Jean Wu ordered, his voice carrying the absolute authority of a man accustomed to life-and-death obedience. "I want 24-hour coverage, and I want them to know they're being watched. Sometimes visibility is the best deterrent." He turned to face Zara, and she saw something in his expression that made her breath catch in her throat. The professional concern was still present, but beneath it burned something infinitely more personal and dangerous. He was looking at her not as a valuable asset to be protected, but as something precious that belonged to him. "They're escalating because they see you as my weakness," he said, his voice gentle despite the steel beneath it. "In their calculation, hurting you would cause me to make emotional rather than strategic decisions. They're not entirely wrong in that assessment." The admission shocked her with its implications. In the space of 3 weeks, she had somehow evolved from convenient asset to potential vulnerability in his carefully ordered world. But rather than calculating ways to minimize that liability, he was instead choosing to strengthen the protection around what they perceived as his weak point. "So what happens now?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. The golden cage was about to become considerably smaller and infinitely more secure. "Now," he replied, moving closer until she could feel the heat radiating from his body, "you stay close to me, not just during business hours, but until this situation resolves itself. The penthouse has a guest suite that will be more secure than your apartment, and proximity will allow my security team to maintain better coverage." The practicality of the arrangement was undeniable, but Zara recognized that accepting would cross a line from which there might be no return. Living in his space, sharing his meals, existing within the intimate boundaries of his private world would change the nature of their relationship in ways that neither could predict or control. But as she looked into his eyes and saw the genuine concern beneath the calculated strategy, she realized that the line had already been crossed weeks ago when he had trusted her with his vulnerability and she had chosen to save his life. Everything since then had been an elaborate dance around the inevitable conclusion that they were bound together by forces stronger than professional arrangement or mutual convenience. "I'll pack tonight," she said, sealing her fate with words that tasted like surrender and freedom in equal measure. His smile this time reached his eyes, transforming his face from mask of authority into something devastatingly human. As the sunset painted the city in shades of gold and crimson beyond the windows, Zara understood that she was about to discover whether the most dangerous man in the city could also be the safest place to hide from the enemies she had made by saving his life. The glass exploded inward like crystalline rain, each shard catching the morning light as it scattered across the marble floor of the penthouse living room. Zara hit the ground behind the leather sofa as Jinwoo security training kicked in with lethal efficiency. His body covering hers before her mind had fully processed that someone had just fired a sniper's bullet through the 42nd floor window. The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 heartbeats before the penthouse erupted into controlled chaos. Security personnel materialized from positions she hadn't known they occupied, speaking in rapid Korean into communication devices while systematically securing every angle of approach. Jinwoo remained pressed against her, his weight solid and reassuring as he shielded her from potential follow-up shots with his own body. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice carrying the deadly calm of a man who had survived similar situations through preparation rather than luck. His breath was warm against her ear, and despite the terror coursing through her system, some traitorous part of her brain noted how perfectly her body fit against his, how her curves aligned with the hard planes of his chest and shoulders. The attempted assassination had been precisely calculated to send a message. The Chin organization wanted Jinwoo to understand that nowhere was safe, that his protection extended only as far as his physical presence, and that the woman who had saved his life could be eliminated with surgical precision from distances that rendered his bodyguards useless. Clear came the report from the security perimeter, though Jinwoo made no move to release her from the protective cage of his arms. The shooter had vanished like smoke, leaving behind only shattered glass and the unmistakable message that Zara Williams had become a priority target for elimination. As they finally rose from the floor, Jinwoo's hands remained on her shoulders, his dark eyes scanning her face for signs of injury with an intensity that felt distinctly personal rather than merely professional. The careful distance he had been maintaining over the past weeks crumbled under the weight of how close he had come to losing her to enemy fire. "We're leaving," he announced, his voice brooking no argument. "The safe house is already prepared. Pack only essentials." Within an hour, they were traveling through the city's underground tunnel system in an armored vehicle that looked like executive transport, but moved with the purposeful efficiency of a military convoy. The safe house turned out to be a converted warehouse in an industrial district, its exterior deliberately unremarkable while its interior had been transformed into a fortress disguised as a luxury apartment. The space was smaller than the penthouse, creating an intimacy that the vast open floors of his corporate headquarters had never fostered. Here, they would exist in closer proximity than ever before, sharing meals and conversations without the buffer of business meetings or professional obligations. The forced domesticity felt both natural and terrifying in ways that Zara struggled to define. That evening, as rain drummed against reinforced windows and security teams maintained their invisible perimeter, Jinwoo prepared dinner with the same methodical precision he brought to business negotiations. Watching him move through the compact kitchen, she realized that beneath the armor of absolute authority lived a man capable of nurturing as well as destroying. "You don't have to take care of me," she observed, though the gesture touched something deep in her chest that had been carefully guarded since childhood. "I'm perfectly capable of feeding myself." His smile carried warmth that she had rarely witnessed in their professional interactions. "Cooking relaxes me," he admitted, adding vegetables to the pan with movements that spoke of long practice. "My grandmother taught me that preparing food for others was a form of meditation, a way of showing care that transcended words." The revelation surprised her with its intimacy. Jinwoo Park discussing his grandmother, while seasoning rice, felt like stepping through a doorway into a room she had never been permitted to enter. She studied his profile as he worked, noting the way his shoulders relaxed when focused on simple domestic tasks, how his perpetual vigilance softened into something approaching peace. "Tell me about her," Zara requested, settling onto one of the bar stools that overlooked the kitchen island. The question felt bold, an invasion of privacy that he might choose not to answer, but curiosity had always been one of her defining characteristics. Jean Wu's hands stilled for a moment before resuming their methodical chopping. "She raised me after my parents died," he said, his voice carrying the weight of old grief carefully managed. "A car accident when I was 12. She was the only family I had left, and she refused to let me disappear into the foster system or become another casualty of circumstances beyond my control." The story unfolded slowly as he cooked, each revelation offered like a gift wrapped in careful vulnerability. His grandmother had been a seamstress who worked 16-hour days to keep food on their table, who had insisted on homework before dinner and respect for education despite their circumstances. She had died when he was 22, just as his involvement with the Beach organization was beginning to offer them financial security for the first time in their shared lives. "She never got to see me succeed," he continued, his voice barely audible above the sizzling vegetables. "Never got to live in comfort or stop worrying about rent payments. Everything I built afterward was tribute to her sacrifice, but she wasn't there to benefit from any of it." Zara felt her heart breaking for the young man he had been, watching his grandmother work herself into an early grave while building the strength and determination that would eventually make him one of the most powerful figures in the city's underworld. She understood now why he had recognized genuine care when she offered it that night in the restaurant, why her intervention had resonated with memories of the only person who had ever prioritized his welfare over her own. "She would have been proud of the man you became," Zara said softly. "Not because of the power or the money, but because you never forgot what she taught you about taking care of people." Jean Wu looked up from his cooking, his expression vulnerable in ways that made her chest tighten with emotions she had been struggling to suppress. In his eyes, she saw the ghost of that 12-year-old boy who had learned too young that survival required building walls around anything precious enough to be lost. The dinner they shared felt like a first date and a last meal simultaneously, charged with the awareness that external forces were conspiring to tear apart whatever fragile connection was building between them. The conversation flowed from childhood memories to philosophical questions about loyalty and sacrifice, two people discovering they shared more common ground than either had expected. It was while they were cleaning dishes together, moving around each other in the small kitchen with surprising synchronization, that Jean Wu's phone vibrated with an encrypted message that changed the color of the entire evening. His expression shifted as he read, the vulnerability disappearing behind the mask of absolute control that had become second nature. "What is it?" Zara asked, though his posture already suggested she might not want to know the answer. "Intelligence from inside Chen's organization," he replied, his voice carrying the deadly calm that preceded violent action. "They've identified your family's location and daily routines. Your brother's class schedule, your parents' work patterns, even your father's weekly poker game. They're building operational intelligence for a coordinated strike." The words hit her like physical blows, each detail demonstrating how thoroughly the enemy had invaded the private spaces of people she loved. Marcus was halfway through his junior year at State, focused on engineering studies and completely unaware that his sister's good deed had placed him in the crosshairs of professional killers. Her parents still lived in the same modest house where she had grown up, following routines that had become predictable enough to be exploited by anyone with patience and malicious intent. "How long do we have?" she asked, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her chest. Jean Wu's pause stretched long enough for her to hear rain against the windows and the distant hum of city traffic beyond their secured perimeter. "According to our source, they're planning to move within the next 48 hours. The strategy appears to be simultaneous strikes designed to eliminate all leverage points and force me into emotional rather than strategic responses." Zara felt something cold and determined settling into the space where fear had been living. These people were threatening her family because she had dared to save a man's life, turning her moment of compassion into a weapon aimed at innocent people who had never chosen to enter this world of violence and retribution. "What do we do?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer would involve the kind of preemptive action that separated Jinwoo's world from the one where problems were solved through police reports and legal proceedings. "We eliminate the threat," he replied, his voice carrying the finality of a man accustomed to making life-and-death decisions. "But first, we get your family to safety. My people are already moving to secure them without alerting Chen's surveillance teams." The efficiency with which he orchestrated protection for people he had never met demonstrated the depth of resources at his disposal. But more importantly, it revealed how completely he had accepted responsibility for the consequences of her choosing to save his life. He was not simply protecting valuable assets. He was safeguarding the people she loved because their welfare had become entangled with his own. As they stood together in the kitchen, surrounded by the domestic remnants of a shared meal, Zara realized that she had fallen in love with the most dangerous man in the city. Not because of his power or wealth or the way other people feared him, but because he possessed the capacity for tenderness that he had learned from a grandmother who worked herself to death to give him a future worth having. The admission terrified her more than sniper bullets or assassination plots. Love in his world was vulnerability weaponized, a target painted on everything precious enough to be used as leverage. But as Jinwoo moved closer, close enough for her to see her own reflection in his dark eyes, she understood that some forces were stronger than the rational fear of consequences. "I won't let them hurt your family," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute commitment. "Whatever it costs, whatever I have to do, they will be safe." The promise fell between them like a bridge spanning impossible distances, an oath that bound him to her protection not through professional obligation, but through something infinitely more personal and dangerous. As thunder rolled across the city beyond their reinforced walls, Zara realized that she was witnessing the moment when Jinwoo Park's legendary control began bending under the weight of emotions he had spent decades learning to suppress. But rather than feeling guilty for introducing chaos into his carefully ordered existence, she felt a fierce satisfaction at being the woman who had made the most controlled man in the city lose his legendary composure. If they were both falling into something that might destroy them, at least they were falling together. Outside their sanctuary, enemies were gathering for strikes designed to tear apart everything they cared about. But inside the warm circle of kitchen light, with rain drumming against secured windows and the scent of shared dinner lingering in the air, Zara Williams allowed herself to believe that some things were worth fighting for, even when the fight might cost everything they hoped to protect. The call came at 3:17 in the morning, shattering the fragile piece of the safe house with the precision of a sledgehammer through glass. Jinwoo answered on the first ring, his voice carrying the controlled alertness of a man who had trained himself to function at full capacity regardless of the hour. But as he listened to the voice on the other end, Zara watched his expression transform from professional wariness to something approaching devastation. "They have your brother," he said after ending the call, each word falling between them like stones dropped into still water. "Marcus was taken from his dormitory 6 hours ago. Clean extraction, no witnesses, no evidence of struggle. Professional work." The world seemed to tilt sideways as Zara processed the information, her mind struggling to reconcile the image of her gentle, studious brother with the reality that he had become a pawn in a game of lethal chess. Marcus worried about calculus exams and whether he could afford textbooks next semester, not whether criminal organizations might use him as leverage in territorial disputes he couldn't begin to understand. Jinwoo moved to the secure laptop positioned on the dining table, his fingers flying across the keyboard with practiced efficiency as he accessed intelligence networks that existed parallel to anything civilian authorities could imagine. Security camera feeds, traffic monitors, and communication intercepts painted a digital portrait of Marcus Williams' disappearance with chilling thoroughness. "They're holding him at a warehouse complex in the industrial district," Jinwoo reported, his voice carrying the deadly calm that preceded strategic violence. The location is heavily fortified, with multiple escape routes and overlapping fields of fire. Chun has essentially dared me to attempt a rescue operation that would require exposing my entire organization to coordinated counterattacks. Zara studied the satellite images on the screen, noting the defensive positions and the calculated placement of vehicles that could provide either escape or additional firepower, depending on circumstances. The Chin organization had transformed her brother's kidnapping into a trap designed to draw Jin Woo into a killing ground where superior numbers and prepared positions would neutralize his tactical advantages. Were they demanding? She asked, though the answer seemed obvious enough. Chun wanted Jin Woo to choose between his empire and her family, forcing an emotional decision that would leave him vulnerable regardless of which option he selected. Territorial concessions that would effectively end Beech's influence in the pharmaceutical distribution network, Jin Woo replied. Complete withdrawal from the northern districts, dissolution of 3 subsidiary organizations, and public acknowledgement of Chun authority over disputed territories. In essence, they want me to dismantle everything my grandmother died to help me build. The price was deliberately impossible, designed to ensure that negotiation would fail and violence would become inevitable. Chun understood that Jin Woo could not accept such terms without destroying his reputation and inviting challenges from every rival organization that sensed weakness. But they also calculated that he could not abandon Zara's brother without revealing that his legendary control had been compromised by emotional attachment. Give them what they want, Zara said quietly, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was suggesting. My brother's life is worth more than territory or money or reputation. Let them have their victory. Jin Woo's expression shifted to something approaching amazement, as if she had just suggested surrendering oxygen in order to breathe more efficiently. The territories represent more than business interests, he explained. They're the foundation that keeps my organization strong enough to protect everyone under our umbrella. Dismantling that structure would leave hundreds of people vulnerable to enemies who would eliminate them simply to prevent future challenges. She understood the impossible mathematics of his position, the way leadership in his world meant accepting responsibility for consequences that extended far beyond personal preferences. Saving Marcus by destroying his empire would ultimately cost more lives than it preserved, creating chaos that would be measured in body counts rather than balance sheets. But as she studied the tactical display showing her brother's location, Zara realized that she refused to accept the false choice Chun had constructed. There had to be a third option, something that involved taking action rather than accepting defeat through negotiation or Pyrrhic victory through capitulation. I'm going to get him, she announced, moving toward the weapons locker that Jin Woo had shown her during their security briefing. The decision formed in her mind with crystalline clarity, terrifying and liberating in equal measure. Chun expects you to come charging in with everything you have, but they won't be prepared for a single person with nothing to lose. Jin Woo's response was immediate and absolute. No, the warehouse is a fortress designed to channel attackers into predetermined killing zones. Even my best operatives would struggle to penetrate those defenses, and you have no combat training whatsoever. His assessment was tactically sound, but emotionally irrelevant. Marcus was her responsibility, her brother whom she had helped raise when their parents worked double shifts to keep food on the table. The thought of him sitting in some concrete cell, terrified and confused by circumstances he could never have anticipated, made rational tactical analysis seem like luxury she could not afford. I saved your life once without combat training, she reminded him, checking the safety on the pistol he had insisted she learn to use during their first week at the safe house. I read people, I see patterns, and I understand what they don't expect. Chin's people are watching for your organization's tactical signature, not for a waitress who improvises solutions. The argument that followed was brief, but intense. Two people who had discovered love in the middle of a war zone disagreeing about how to protect what they had found. Jin Woo's position was grounded in professional experience and genuine concern for her safety. Zara's was driven by the kind of desperate determination that made impossible situations suddenly negotiable through sheer force of will. The compromise they reached satisfied neither of them completely, but acknowledged the reality that time was running out and conventional rescue operations would likely result in Marcus's death, followed by coordinated strikes against Jin Woo's remaining assets. She would attempt infiltration while he positioned his forces for extraction support, ready to provide overwhelming firepower if her approach failed or circumstances required more direct action. The warehouse district at dawn looked like a monument to industrial decay, concrete and steel structures rising from cracked asphalt like tombstones marking the death of legitimate commerce. Zara approached on foot, using the early morning shadows and her understanding of how people position surveillance to remain invisible to watching eyes that expected threats to arrive in armed convoys rather than worn sneakers. The Chin organization's security was professional but predictable, focused on preventing vehicle approaches and monitoring obvious infiltration routes. They had not anticipated someone who understood that the best camouflage was appearing to belong in surroundings where her presence should seem ordinary rather than threatening. She moved through the complex like a ghost, using maintenance corridors and service entrances that security teams often overlooked in favor of more obvious approaches. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she navigated closer to the central building where intelligence suggested Marcus was being held. Every shadow, potentially concealing armed guards who would end her rescue attempt with terminal efficiency. But as she reached the perimeter of the target structure, Zara realized that Chun had anticipated even her unconventional approach. The setup was too clean, too convenient, with gaps in security coverage that felt deliberate rather than accidental. She was walking into a trap designed specifically for someone attempting exactly the kind of improvised rescue she had planned. The realization came simultaneously with the sound of boots on concrete behind her, multiple sets moving with coordinated precision to cut off her escape routes. Chen's men emerged from positions of concealment like pieces on a chessboard that had been waiting for their moment to reveal the true scope of the game being played. The trap had been comprehensive from the beginning, designed not just to capture Jin Woo, but to eliminate both potential threats through a strategy that used Zara's love for her brother and Jin Woo's growing attachment to her as weapons against them both. Chen had counted on her refusing to let Jin Woo sacrifice his empire, just as he had counted on Jin Woo's inability to abandon her to face the consequences alone. But what Chun had not calculated was the possibility that Jin Woo Park would arrive at the warehouse complex with the full lethal capability of the Beach organization unleashed in protection of a woman who had become more important to him than the empire he had spent his adult life building. The assault began with surgical precision as armored vehicles crashed through the perimeter defenses like mechanical predators scenting blood. Jin Woo's security teams moved with the coordinated efficiency of a military unit, eliminating defensive positions with overwhelming firepower while advancing toward the central structure where both Zara and Marcus were being held. Inside the warehouse, Zara found herself fighting alongside her captured brother against guards who had clearly not expected their hostages to possess either the motivation or capability for resistance. Marcus, despite his terror, proved surprisingly effective at following her instructions as they used overturned furniture and industrial equipment for cover, while Jin Woo's forces systematically dismantled Chen's defensive network. The final confrontation occurred in the warehouse's main floor, where Chun Lu himself waited with the confidence of a man who believed victory was inevitable regardless of tactical developments. He held Marcus at gunpoint, while his remaining operatives positioned themselves for a last stand designed to ensure that even if the rescue succeeded, it would cost Jin Woo everything he cared about protecting. But as Jin Woo emerged from the smoke and chaos with blood on his suit and death in his eyes, Chen made the fatal mistake of underestimating the woman who had twice saved the most dangerous man in the city. Zara used the distraction of Jin Woo's arrival to execute the kind of desperate improvisation that had worked in a restaurant, creating enough confusion for Marcus to break free while positioning herself between Chen's weapon and the man she loved. The gunshot that followed echoed through the concrete space like thunder, but when the smoke cleared and the final accounting was made, Chun-Lu lay dead from Jinwoo's return fire, while Zara stood bleeding from a grazing wound that had come within inches of ending her life for the second time in less than a month. Marcus was safe. The Chun organization was eliminated as a threat, and the most feared crime boss in the city knelt beside a wounded waitress whose courage had repeatedly saved his life in ways that tactical superiority and overwhelming firepower could never accomplish. As Jinwoo's hands shook while applying pressure to her wounded shoulder, Zara realized that they had both been irrevocably changed by the violence they had survived together. The careful walls he had built around his emotions lay in ruins, while she had discovered reserves of strength and determination that would have been impossible to imagine in her previous life, serving coffee to customers who barely acknowledged her existence. The rescue was complete, the immediate threats neutralized, and the two people who had found love in the middle of a war zone faced the challenge of building a future on the foundation of choices that had revealed exactly how far they were willing to go to protect what mattered most. In the aftermath of gunfire and desperate gambles that had somehow resulted in victory rather than mutual destruction, Jinwoo Park and Zara Williams finally understood that some bonds were forged in circumstances too intense for either logic or fear to dissolve. 3 weeks after the warehouse battle that had eliminated the Chun organization and rescued her brother, Zara stood in the penthouse office where their complicated arrangement had first been negotiated. The space felt different now, charged with the memory of shared violence and mutual protection rather than the careful neutrality of professional obligation. Sunlight streamed through newly installed bulletproof windows, casting patterns across the marble floor that had been scrubbed clean of any evidence that assassins had once tried to end her life in this very room. Jinwoo sat behind his desk with a stack of legal documents that represented the formal dissolution of everything that had bound her to his organization through circumstance rather than choice. The contracts that had made her his employee, the agreements that had placed her family under his protection, the financial arrangements that had transformed her from waitress to protected asset, all of it reduced to paper that he was prepared to void with his signature. "Your employment contract is terminated as of this moment," he said, his voice carrying the controlled formality of a man conducting business despite the emotional weight of what he was actually offering. "Your family's protection remains in place permanently, but it is no longer contingent on your cooperation or presence. You're free to leave, to return to your previous life, to disappear entirely if that is what you choose." The papers lay between them like a bridge leading away from the world of violence and luxury that had become her reality. Zara understood that he was giving her something infinitely precious in his universe, the chance to walk away without consequences or obligations, to reclaim the ordinary existence she had been forced to abandon when she chose to save his life in an upscale restaurant that felt like another lifetime ago. But as she studied his face, noting the careful neutrality that barely concealed the vulnerability beneath, she realized that freedom meant nothing if it required abandoning the man who had become the center of her transformed world. The choice he was offering was genuine, but the life she wanted was not the one that existed outside these walls. "Why?" she asked, though she suspected she already understood the answer. "Why give me something you've never offered anyone else?" Jinwoo rose from his desk and moved to the windows that overlooked the city sprawling below them like a kingdom built of light and ambition. His reflection in the glass showed a man who had learned to be vulnerable without losing strength, who had discovered that some forms of power could only be claimed through surrender. "Because I want you to choose me," he said simply. "Not because circumstances trapped you here, not because you needed protection or money or security, but because being with me is what you actually want. I need to know that if you stay, it's because this is where you belong, not where you're forced to remain." The admission hung between them like a declaration of war against every principle that had governed his rise to power. In his world, loyalty was purchased through fear or necessity, maintained through obligation and mutual benefit. But he was asking for something infinitely more dangerous and precious, the kind of devotion that could only be freely given by someone who possessed the power to leave. Zara moved closer until she could see her own reflection beside his in the bulletproof glass. Two people who had been transformed by violence into something stronger than either could have been alone. The city below them pulsed with life and danger and opportunity, a vast network of possibilities that suddenly seemed less appealing than the man who stood beside her offering everything he had become. "I choose you," she said, her voice carrying the finality of a woman who understood exactly what she was accepting and rejecting. "Not your money or your protection or the safety of your world, but you. The man who cooks dinner to show he cares, who put his empire at risk to save my brother, who learned to be gentle without losing his strength." Jinwoo turned to face her, and she saw tears threatening the composure he had spent decades perfecting. His hands, which had directed lethal violence and commanded absolute obedience, trembled slightly as he reached for her face with the reverence of a man touching something sacred. "I love you," he said, the words carrying the weight of a lifetime spent building walls that she had somehow convinced him to tear down. "Not as my employee or my protected asset or my cultural liaison, but as the woman who saved my life by caring whether I lived or died when no one else in that room would have lifted a finger to help me." Their kiss tasted like triumph and surrender simultaneously, the claiming of two people who had found something worth fighting for in the middle of circumstances that should have destroyed any possibility of genuine connection. When they finally separated, both understood that they had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return to the careful boundaries of their original arrangement. The engagement party 6 months later was held in the same penthouse where she had first negotiated the terms of her golden cage, though the space had been transformed into something that reflected their combined presence rather than his solitary authority. Representatives from both the legitimate business world and the more shadowy networks of his actual empire mingled over champagne and carefully prepared conversation that acknowledged his power without explicitly discussing its sources. Marcus stood beside their parents near the spectacular view of the city, his engineering degree completed with the assistance of educational funding that had appeared in his financial aid package without explanation or strings attached. Her family had adapted to their new circumstances with the pragmatic acceptance of people who understood that some questions were better left unasked, especially when the answers came with guarantees of safety and security that extended far beyond anything they could have achieved through conventional means. Jinwoo moved through the gathering with the confident grace of a man who had found peace with his dual existence, equally comfortable discussing pharmaceutical patents with corporate executives and territorial arrangements with lieutenants whose loyalty had been tested through shared violence. But his attention remained anchored to Zara, tracking her location in the room with the focused awareness of someone who had learned that happiness was fragile enough to require constant protection. When he finally called for quiet and raised his glass to address their gathered guests, the words he spoke carried the weight of a man who had discovered that some forms of strength could only be found through vulnerability. "To my future wife," he said, his voice carrying across the room with the authority that had made him a legend and the tenderness that only she had been permitted to witness, "who taught me that the most dangerous thing in the world is caring about someone more than you care about your own survival, and that some risks are worth taking regardless of the consequences." The applause that followed was genuine, though she suspected that most of their guests understood they were witnessing something unprecedented in Jinwoo Park's carefully controlled existence. The most dangerous man in the city had just publicly declared that his greatest weakness was also his greatest strength, that love had made him more vulnerable and more powerful simultaneously. As the evening progressed, and their guests gradually departed into the night that held no threats for people under Beek's protection, Zara found herself alone with Jinwoo on the terrace overlooking the city that had become their shared kingdom. The platinum engagement ring on her finger caught the light from the urban landscape below, a symbol of commitment that had been chosen rather than imposed, accepted rather than endured. "Do you ever regret it?" Jinwoo asked, his arm around her waist as they watched the traffic flowing through streets where his influence touched every corner and shadow. "Giving up the ordinary life you had before to build something extraordinary with a man whose world includes violence and danger as permanent residents." Zara considered the question seriously, weighing the weight of what she had gained against everything she had surrendered when she chose to save his life that night in the restaurant. The answer came with the clarity that had guided every major decision since she had smelled bitter almonds and expensive wine and decided that some lines were worth crossing. "Never," she replied, turning in his arms until she could see her own reflection in his eyes. "You gave me the chance to discover who I really was beneath the uniform and the polite service and the careful invisibility. I found out that I was brave enough to save the most dangerous man in the city and strong enough to love him without losing myself in the process." Their future stretched before them like an unwritten story, filled with the kind of challenges that could only be faced by people who had learned to protect each other through anything their enemies might devise. But as they stood together on the terrace where assassins had once tried to end their love before it could fully bloom, Jean-Woo Park and Zara Williams understood that they had built something powerful enough to survive whatever storms might come. The most feared crime boss in the city had learned to surrender without losing his strength. The invisible waitress had discovered her own power without sacrificing her capacity for compassion. Together, they had created a partnership that transformed the careful distance of their original arrangement into something that felt like coming home. What did you think of this story of unexpected love and courage in dangerous circumstances? Have you ever found yourself caring so deeply about someone that you were willing to risk everything to protect them? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because stories like these remind us that sometimes the most powerful force in the world is simply deciding that another person's life matters more than your own safety.